This is one of my favorite Ferraris. I think this came out in 1999, but this is not what we're going to talk about in this video. What we're going to talk about in this video is variables, specifically starting with declarations. What's a variable? What's a declaration? Well, a variable holds some value that we're assigning to it or tagging to it. So in this case, the left-hand side is the variable. I'm calling it my variable, my underscore variable, and that's going to contain a 42. As we understand it, that's an integer. Now, we could also reassign that variable to something else. That same variable that we defined to 42, we can assign it to hello world, and it would take on that new value. We can do that as many times as we want. So we have to be careful working through our code and our programs that we have the same value, or we expect the value that we want, right? Or we're getting the value that we expect, in other words. So we got to be very careful because we can do this on the fly. Naming convention. Well, in Python, we use snake case. What does that mean? That means one word, all lowercase, underscore, combined with the next word. And that gets assigned whatever the value. This is an integer, this is a float, a decimal point, and this is a string. They're all different types, and we could assign different types to different variables. We can actually assign different types to the same variable. We're going to see that. We see that in Python and dynamic programming languages like this, dynamically typed, because we can have different variables take on different types at runtime at different points. So we have to be careful. That's super flexible. That's neither a negative or a positive. That's just something that we have to be aware of. Those are the rules, so we don't get into any trouble. Scope. We'll talk about scope in a further video, so make sure you check that out. But I do want to highlight that variables have different scope, meaning depending on where you declare them, you will have visibility or not have visibility to that variable. So in this case, we have some function called my function. We're defining this local variable to contain I am local. That's a string. We're going to print it, and just to show that that's there. And at the same time, we have to remember that it's not available outside the function. Inside this function, sure, we have access to this variable. Outside here, if we were to use the same command, print local variable out here in line 64, it would not be around. So pay attention to that. I'll have a further video on functions and on scope specifically, but just wanted to highlight the scope is a big deal when we talk about variables. The next thing I wanted to talk about was reading and writing. So we know that we can assign some value to a variable, right when we declare it, or we can reassign it. We could always read that variable. In this case, we're just reading X. We're not changing X. We're reading X and reassigning it to Y, right? So just remember that there's two ways that we can go at variables. One is reading, the other one is writing. Dynamic typing is what I was referring to a little minute ago, which is we can have a variable contain an integer 42. If we were to print it, sure, it would output 42, but that same variable defined, for example, in line 96, we could redefine it, reassign it in line 99, and it would completely change the value of that variable, and we can print it and we can use it as we wish. So that is dynamic typing. Just to give you some context, in other programming languages, once you define a variable as containing an integer, it should contain an integer, and you can't change it without a lot of work. Well, basically, you shouldn't change it. It's meant to be an integer. You cannot assign to that variable, let's, for example, a string, right, and vice versa, and that type of thing. Now, just keep in mind, there is a notion of casting, and we'll talk about that in a further video as well. But without those edge cases that you can manipulate the type, in other languages, we cannot have a variable and change it to another type. on the fly in other languages. We can do so in Python. And by the way, in Python we do have casting, so bear that in mind. But just to note that on the fly here, we could do this with Python, really flexible. Python takes the idea, the philosophy of, hey, I'm flexible, I'll do whatever you want. You're the developer. I'm trusting you that you know what you're doing. I'm not going to get in your way. That's Python's philosophy. So keep that in mind. Lastly, I wanted to talk about printing, because I did show printing a couple of variables here, and I just wanted to show that print is a method. Well, let's talk about functions first. Print is a function that takes some value or some variable and it prints it. And in this case, this is a string literal. So I'm printing a string literal. That's a single value. This is printing multiple values. Well, I'm defining the name, the age variable, and then I'm printing some string literal followed by a comma, just to say, hey, I want to print more than one thing. The next thing I want to print is this name variable. So it's not going to print the literal string name. It's going to print whatever name contains. That's going to be printed here. And we're going to print then age, the string literal, followed by a comma, just to separate all the things that I want to print. And here I'm going to print the age, which is an integer 5, containing the integer 5. Just remember that we do commas to separate the different things that we want to print. And just remember that one important thing is we want to put quotes with our strings. If we don't have quotes, that's very different than something with quotes. This means this is a variable. Python, go get it, resolve it, and display whatever the value is. As a bonus, or not a bonus, but just to finish up our talk about printing and the print method specifically, this is one thing I want you to remember, which is we have a separator and an end parameter that we can send to the print method. And what does that mean? That means that, sure, we can print multiple values separated by commas, but then this is completely optional. We don't need it here. But in our case, we do want it here, because I'm going to show how you can separate each one of these values when you print it to contain a comma between these. And the end is what to say or do at the end. In this case, we can say something like end, just so that we can make it super obvious. Exclamation mark, end, exclamation mark. If we save this and we run this, we're going to see right from the top here, right from the function, we're going to say I am local. That happens inside. That's what's happening here. 42 then gets printed here. That's what this is happening here. And then hello Ferrari gets printed here. That's what happens here. The same variable gets printed, even though it contained 42 previously. Now it has hello Ferrari. Printing a single value, it says hello Ferrari for this one. Printing multiple values, we have the name and the age, right? Just like this one. Notice how the commas don't come out here. That's just to separate. That's just to separate here the different things that you want to print. That's not going to be printed. Just highlighting that. And lastly, we have this last one here, which says print 1, 2, and 3 separated by commas. And at the end of this print statement, go ahead and print this string. And that's exactly what we see here. By default, if you don't do the end, what you do get is that it prints an extra return, right? It creates a space. So why am I saying that? I'm just highlighting that because if you don't have a parameter like this, you get one by default. And what that contains is a character like this, and we'll talk about this later, but this is a /n. This is an escape character to tell Python, hey, look, Python, I don't want you to print the letter N or the character N. I want you to do a new space, do a new carriage return, right? So that's what that means. It gives it special meaning to Python, that it's not N, it's something else, and we know the meaning of /n is an extra return. So if we run this, we get the same thing as not having it, again, because it's a default, right? Hope you enjoyed.